I know people who look into what they call abduction and contact. They call them contactees. I'm very dubious about the whole thing. I've met several who I really do believe that they are telling their truth about something. But often what happens with these experiences that people have is it destabilizes them. So their recollection of what happened is probably nothing like what actually did happen. So I think that a lot of these people who think that they've been contacted by aliens and all the rest of it are actually under some kind of attack by an entity.
Mhm.
And I have interviewed people who really believe this stuff.
Some people
But,
like to develop relationships with these things.
well, yes, there's lots and lots to it. I looked into the UFO thing. In fact, I inherited a library of somebody who'd collected all these books from the 50s onwards, including the first ones, like Flying Saucers Are Real, showing you all these UFOs, these photographs of them. And then it kind of became part of the mass consciousness in the 50s as part of an alternative to the Cold War. In other words, the off-planetary invasion, War of the Worlds, etc. There was lots of films in the 50s about aliens landing. That was a big thing. I think when the sci-fi got involved with it all, it spawned a kind of industry. So it spawned this belief in people's imaginations, flying saucers, all that.
Mhm.
Well, what's in them? Well, they can't just be demonic entities. There must be someone driving them, right? So that's where it all came from, I think. And it got accentuated. And I think it's got accentuated into the minds of the public. I mean, I'm not denigrating people who think they've been abducted. It's just that it sounds often to me as though it's not that.
Well, hello guys. I'm here with a guy called Mark Windows, and Mark Windows is a filmmaker, broadcaster, and host of the weekly radio show Windows on the World. He produces all the content for Windows of the World, or excuse me, Windows on the World, and is the host of the weekly show Windows on the World, which previews every Sunday at 9 p.m. He also has a film in production for release, or has that been released? The
It's been
Heretics,
released,
right?
Michael.
Okay,
It's out
excuse.
there now. It's on the website. Yeah.
Right, the Heretics of London. Okay, can
Yes.
you speak about that film? It's something about Smithfield during the 1500s.
Yes, I started to go to this area known as Smithfield, which was previously known as the Smoothfield, and it's just outside the old city walls in London. And it's a fascinating place. Not only was it a market and a fair for 700 years, but it was also a place of execution for nearly 1,000 years. And from 1401, heretics, people who went originally against some of the Catholic doctrine, including transubstantiation, and would not recant, were burnt at the stake. And the first burning in Smithfield was 1401. And it carried on until the end of Queen Mary's reign, which was in the middle 1500s.
Hmm. Okay, fantastic. Now, I heard you reading from a book once, and it was from a book by a guy called Scott R. Rocco, was it? Is that his
D.
name?
Scott Rogo.
D. Scott Rocco, excuse
Yeah.
me. The Infinite Boundary, I think it was.
Yes.
And you were reading a very interesting chapter, and it was to do with alcoholics or heavy drinkers and
Yes.
some of the attachments that they sometimes get. Could you speak about that?
Yes. I looked into parapsychology and people who were around in the 50s and 60s, including Charles T. Tart. And D. Scott Rogo was around in the 70s. And he looked at paranormal phenomena. And this book you're talking about, The Infinite Boundary, was a collection of case studies, actually. They weren't stories, they were actually case studies of these phenomena. And there was several stories in that book. I don't know which one you're referring to, but I can give a general outline if that's what you want.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, there was the Infinite Boundary. It's really about madness, possession, and multiple personality. And the cases in it are absolutely fascinating. They go
Hmm.
from psychic things happening to really extraordinary demonic realms, and how people are caught up in things, and they're caught up in the the kind of machinations of demonic entities, and also people who have passed on, who somehow attach themselves to people. And I think the first story was about an artist that walked past another artist every day, didn't really know him, and found that when this artist died, this fellow had walked past him for ages just saying hello, started to paint his unfinished pictures. And he actually became quite a well-known artist in his own right. He contacted the widow of the fellow who died, this other artist, and he found out that he was actually finishing and painting pictures which this other fellow had started, which was absolutely fascinating.
Hmm. And there was another, you mentioned something about a guy going into a pub and he was seeing all these spirits attached to the drinkers.
Yes, that's called, let me see, that book is about a private Ritchie who joined the United States Air Force as a conscript, and he was in an Air Force hospital. He got really, really ill, and he left his body, and he could see other people. He was having an out of body experience. He was in the hospital, and he started to move around this airbase. And in the end, he got to the bar, and he saw all his mates there drinking. And as they got more and more drunk, he saw these spirits, these entities ready to jump into them. And when they got really drunk, the entities jumped into them because that was the consent they needed. And this, I think, is very important because people do have an openness to this sort of thing when they get drunk, because obviously you lose your consciousness, you use your conscious ability. And if you are completely out of your head, these things jump in. I found it really fascinating. And it does tie in, doesn't it, with what happens to a lot of people when they get drunk.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing you mentioned, and it was a term that intrigued me, was about the New Age movement and some of the practices that goes on in the New Age movement, and you mentioned it as being candy floss spirituality or something to that effect. Could you elaborate more on that? What you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, the New Age really goes back to Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, then Alex Bailey later on, who kind of teamed up with the UN and the Lucis Trust, originally the Lucifer Trust. And these people, Annie Besant, of course, these people were behind what was the New Age movement. But by the 70s, the 1970s, it had been taken over by the United Nations. And they started latching on to a lot of New Age teachings, and they still do to this day. And Robert Mueller, who was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations in the 70s, put on and was part of, actually, he was instrumental in the Mind, Body, Spirit Festival in California, which I think the first one was in 1980. But he'd written several books, theses rather, on education. And he was trying to bring this new system of Gaia into education, which was basically this neo-pagan worship of Mother Earth. And of course, the United Nations hijacked this and turned it into an environmental project, which wasn't an environmental project, but the New Age actually came out of these people. So that's a really interesting thing, that we have a global governance system being implemented by the United Nations, which is based on various degrees of the New Age. And that actually goes into not just the environmental stuff, this neo-pagan worship of the earth, but also channeling. And he actually, this is Robert Mueller, he actually did this essay where he was talking to Mother Earth. And guess what? Mother Earth was saying exactly what the UN wanted to hear. The earth was saying there was too many people, and the earth was crying. She was very upset because there was too many people on the earth. And of course, this was just used as a driver of change for the present sustainable development and the global depopulation plan, which they've been actually part of for about 50 years now. But the New Age movement expanded and expanded with the help of the United Nations. A lot of people don't know that they were instrumental in bringing together a lot of these sort of cults from India, and Hinduism generally. So they sort of cherry picked bits of Hinduism which appeal to Westerners, and they used it. And what we have as a result of that is what they call the fourth world, which is the wilderness of the mind, the borderless planet. Even though we talk about everyone being locked down now, what they're talking about is borderless in the respect that everything's the same and everything is part of a hive mind, this communitarian system. So the new age is a driver of change which brings people into collectivism. And that's exactly what they want, you see, because once you collectivize people into these groups and they start meditating, they are open to suggestion. And that's putting it mildly. They're basically open to brainwashing. And the result of that is that a lot of them get into channeling, they become mentally unstable. And of course, the whole point of this is that the UN global system wants dependence. So if people are unstable, then they're dependent. And there's that system of moods which runs through the whole thing. So the idea is that they give somebody a little bit of what they want. And the New Age have done a lot of work on that. I'm summarizing vastly here because otherwise we'll be on it all night and I can get carried away with it. But those are just a few pointers to bring you into what I was talking about there. And that's definitely it's a big part of what's going on.
How effective do you think the UN has been in implementing the New Age practices, like stuff like channeling? Can you give an example, actually, where the UN has actually encouraged somebody to go channeling?
Well, they do it with the Lucis Trust, for instance, when they do the invocation of light in the UN building. They use the Lucis Trust invocation of light, which is basically Lucifer. And they also have a prayer room, a meditation room in the UN building. I think it's the one in New York. I'm not sure. It's a long time since I've actually looked at that particular bit of information. But if you look at, I think it's the UN building, I think it's New York actually, that they have an altar. They have a prayer room. It's pagan altar, you see. It's pagan. That's the point. So this neo-paganism is what they push. And you can see the connections, not just through the Lucis Trust, but through Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller was a New Ager. Alice Bailey, her stuff is pushed through the United Nations. She has the Lucis Trust have seats at the United Nations, as do cults like the Brahma Kumaris, who are a New Age cult. And they are Hindu-based, but they are a brainwashing cult.
What are your thoughts on J.D. Krishnamurti? He was brought over to be something like this New Age New Age God, I think, or New Age leader,
Yes.
and he rejected it. What are your thoughts on him?
Well, I'm glad he rejected it, and that's quite interesting. I found all of these people were very affected by this Eastern thought, and the interesting thing is, of course, that Hinduism at its most basic is paganism as well, because they worship multiple gods, multiple festivals, and it involves a lot of animal sacrifice. And also in the lower levels of Hinduism, there's a lot of black magic, not with the Brahmins, but in general day-to-day worship, people use a lot of black magic practices in Hinduism. And these gullible Westerners aren't aware of that. They think Hinduism is some great philosophy. Well, it is at the top end, but of course, the day-to-day kind of worship that goes on in Hinduism is quite robotic, actually. You know, it's not really about, it doesn't really come from a central spiritual force. It comes from an external force, which they worship. And the festivals are great fun. I think that the people that I know who are Hindus, I think they're great. But it's not, to me, a religion that you can just sort of gloss over. There's lots of different aspects of it, you see. For instance, in Hinduism, anything goes. There are tribes of Hindus who will live in graveyards, put snakes in their hair, never wash, put the cremated ashes all over their faces, you know, and just leave it there. So the Agora, I think they're called. And there's all these very strange sects. And of course, you have the traveling kind of shamans. Well, they're not shamans. They're I've forgotten the word for it now, but I'll come back to me. But they have them all over. Sadhus. They have them all over India and Nepal, and they're basically con men who go around just scrounging money off people, and people there can see through it. So the Westerners are very gullible to this, and that's why the New Age has been used. It went into self-help, you see, with people like Deepak Chopra. It went more into self-empowerment. It went more into the think and grow rich, you know, abundance.
Is
But
that
I
what you
manifest my reality, you know.
is that what you meant about the candy floss aspect of it?
Yes, I think it's incredibly superficial, and it removes real spirituality in favor of a kind of, yes, a group hive mind kind of brainwashing. And that's what happened to a lot of Westerners who went over to India. The documentary called Gods of the New Age, you can watch that on YouTube and other channels. It's really worth watching because that was made in the 80s, and it shows you how these gullible Westerners are drawn into these cults. It's been going on ever since.
You mean like the 60s, the Beatles and
I think that was the start of it, yeah.
Mhm.
The Maharishi.
Mhm.
You see, that's a really interesting point, because there's a whole load of these people, and when you actually get close to it, you find out that these people are charlatans. They might be very clever, like Bhagwan, but they are charlatans in the respect that they are not what they
Mhm.
democracy.
Sorry, you're breaking up a bit there for me. I don't know if it's my connection or yours. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you
Yeah,
fine.
okay, good. Yeah. So, well, going back to Krishnamurti, I've listened to a few of his talks,
Hmm.
and some of them I have to say are very insightful, very spiritual. What would you consider real spirituality? What, in your opinion, what is real spirituality?
Well, to me, it's more about something that has to be learned and experienced. It can't just come from an external force. You can't get it externally. You can look at where, to me, the real power is in the early Christian teachings. I'm not really talking about the Catholic Church. I'm talking about
The way.
the way, exactly, the truth and the way. And I think people miss that, because what the early disciples of Jesus were doing was showing a very strong and direct truth to the world. And at the moment, everything's a lie. So
What
that's in direct opposition to what's going on now.
what was that truth that
Well,
they
the
were
truth
showing?
was about the inner truth which people have, which is unstoppable, and the inner integrity, honesty, and this belief that you are able to do God's work. And through that, you can then improve yourself. And I hate to say it, but empower yourself too. And I think that the reason that Christianity has been attacked is because it has an innate power. And the whole of the last 2,000 years has been trying to destroy that. This was the results of my research, because all of these organizations, like the UN global governance system, they're trying to destroy Christianity. They'll bring in anything apart from Christianity. So why is that? Why are they so scared of it? You know, I'm not being devoutly religious here. I'm just asking the question, why are they scared of it? Why are they scared of this force?
Why are they? Why?
Exactly.
Mhm. In your opinion, what would you say? What is the reason? Is it because it is the truth, that it is actually the way? Like what?
Yes, because the whole of the new system is based on deception. And those who are behind that system masquerade behind a religion which is not a religion, which is basically pagan, and it could be anything they want. So they have no basis for their belief system. And that is very important. Also, when we look at the demonic side of things, these people tend to gravitate towards that for power. Now, as we've found out over the past several years with the work we've done on windowsontheworld.net and with Jerry Marzinski, these demons can be conquered. So there's something going on here which I think is very powerful. This is my experience, and it's all based on experience. Actually, it's based on real experiences. So I think that this has been the most fascinating revelation for me, that everything imposed is artificial or it's a lie. And if it's artificial or it's a lie, then it's not based on truth. Therefore, these people must in some way fear the truth.
Mm. In 2007, I lived in Dublin for a while, and I lived across from the Botanic Gardens. And one evening I was in my room, and it was around 5 or 6, and I fell asleep on the bed. And at one point I woke up, and I was being, I wouldn't say attacked, but I was being kissed. Would you believe it? And I didn't. It's not that I woke up. I was half awake, half. I guess you could call it sleep paralysis. But I was being. Something was trying to kiss me. Now it wasn't pleasant, right? Even though it wasn't unpleasant. But the reason I'm saying it wasn't pleasant was because when I actually did manage to open my eyes, I had tears in them. So even though it didn't feel unpleasant, something in me, deep in me, thought it was unpleasant enough that it would form tears in my eyes. But something was over me, and something was trying to kiss me, and I could sense it with my, if you want to call it, spirit, but I couldn't see it. What would you say about that?
Sounds like an intrusion. It sounds like something was trying to get you to consent to it in some way, which is like a succubus. And now a succubus is usually a female if you're a male, and it will try and have sex with you or try and steal your energy. But there's other entities, I mean, I've experienced these things myself, and sometimes they've come through other people. Sometimes they've just appeared. And the main thing is not to consent to anything. Don't give any of your energy to it, and withdraw your energy from it, and use your innate energy to repel it. You see that? I think this is all about consent, and this is how people get possessed. And if they open themselves up through drugs, often it's through abuse, then that's where these things get in. And if it comes through abuse, it's a big problem, because it's very, very difficult for those people to get rid of that, because they've accepted it in, and they have a lifelong struggle with the situation that they're in. And that is what I've talked about with Jerry. And the outcomes of that can be paranoid schizophrenia. I believe that is, in certain cases, what causes it, these demonic attachments. But there has to be some form of consent. It seems to be the way that the universe works. You have to give into it, or it has to coerce you, because they need, for some reason, it's like a contractual thing. This is my view, that they need consent. And indeed, the Catholic Church is very aware of this as well. So their history of demonology is very, very long, and they believe in it. In some ways, I believe that they've channeled it. I believe that they use it, because it's a system after all.
How do you mean they challenge? How do you mean they use it? They challenge it?
Well, some of those popes were actually buried in lead caskets so that they couldn't escape. This was the belief system. The whole thing about the pagan altar came from the Catholic Church. It's not a Christian thing at all. So the altar is for sacrifice, and they are, to me, far too close through the abuse that's gone on through the priesthood. They're far too close to, for my liking, to be involved with, because I think there's so many ambiguities being brought into the Catholic Church that I don't think you can say it's truly Christian anymore, in the respect that we were talking, in the way we were talking about it as the way. That's my view. Although there are many good Catholics out there, and I wouldn't want to insult them or, upset them about that. But it's something to think about, that I think you have to make this conscious effort to be vigilant that nothing gets in.
What would be the key differences between the way and Catholicism nowadays? What would be the key differences?
Well, when we look at things like the Fourth Lateran Council, even the Council of Nicaea, we see that you're starting to build this cult. It's basically a cult, and the Romans used it to start with, and it has been referred to as the Roman cult. Constantine's Christianity, I believe, was a kind of conglomeration, because it wasn't really about the true teachings. It was about this new form of Christianity that they were promoting, which revolved around the Holy Trinity. And when we get to, say, we look at the papal bulls, we can look at things like the Fourth Lateran Council 1215 and this announcement that people who went against or did not agree with the mass transubstantiation were heretics and they should be destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. This is not what the true Christianity was about at all. And I don't think that's what is really meant when Christ said, "Here, take my blood." I don't think he meant it the way the Catholic Church have interpreted it. That's my opinion. Other people may disagree with that and they may have a different view. But as far as this idea that you go in there and the priest gets the wafer and the wine and it transubstantiates into the literal flesh and blood of Jesus Christ, I think is not what the early religion was about. And indeed, I don't think the Old Testament had anything to do with Christianity whatsoever. Of course, it doesn't. The New Testament has a lot of stories. I like to go back to the Gospels and the philosophy of what it was really about. So I think that when we get into a system of priesthood and the priest turns his back on God in 1962 with Vatican II, then there's something going on symbolically here that I don't think is very healthy personally.
So if you don't think that the Old Testament was irrelevant to the New Testament, well, it obviously was irrelevant to the New Testament, but okay, who was the God of the Old Testament, so in your opinion?
It was Yahweh, and that God is the jealous and cruel God of this group of people who masquerade under a title, under a religion, which they don't adhere to, and they never adhere to it. So in other words, this is a problem because you've got a cult, a pagan cult, which revolves around a temple, a Messiah, an animal sacrifice. And if it doesn't have those three things, then it can't be that religion. So then we get into the later books, once we get to sorry, I'm a bit tired here.
You mean the prophets, or you mean the?
No. I'm talking about the Talmud and the Gemara, the original books of law, and this is nothing to do with the way or Christianity. In a way, it's the complete opposite. So I don't have any interest in, that the Old Testament's interest as a book. It's interesting, but I don't think it has any relevance to what we've been talking about. That's my personal view.
What? Who, in your opinion, who was Christ? Well,
I think he existed because there is written testimony of around that time, although they say nothing was written during the time of Jesus Christ. We don't really know that, but I think more importantly is there was somebody around who was actually challenging directly the Pharisees and scribes, and he had a divine power. Now, I'm not saying that divine power is in any way unique to one person. Maybe it isn't, but there's something in the truth of what those early followers were doing, which seems to be the key to a lot of things. For instance, to repel demons and evil spirits, the 23rd Psalm works very well. And that's a known fact. So there's something here. We're talking about a system. So I think that the philosophy is extremely interesting, but the inner truth, the way, and this method of truth is paramount to what's going on. So I don't see the worship of Jesus Christ as important in that. I think he was a real person. I think that him and his brother James existed. Their is a lot of really good stuff in the Gospels, and the Nag Hammadi texts are very interesting too. So I'm not just talking about the New Testament.
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
deducing the
Uh,
philosophy behind it. Yeah.
mhm, mhm. So going back to, as you said, the succubi, is a
Yeah.
succubi a demon?
Yes, it's an entity. It's a parasitic entity which masquerades as something it isn't. Usually, they have another creature called Lilith, which is an old Canaanite goddess, and Lilith is also mentioned in the books of the ancient Jews, and well, those this is a difficult thing actually, because the when we use the word Jew, we have to know what we're talking about. We're not talking about those people who call themselves Jews today, because this it's the history of it is completely messed up when you look at it. So yeah, they had Lilith, you see, and Lilith is an archetype. So what was attacking you could have been Lilith or the archetype. It seems to work as an archetype. So some of these demons, they're kind of universal in a way, but that just means maybe what they're masquerading as, you see. So I had a similar thing in front of me one night, and I think I know where it had come from. I think I knew who it had come from as well, but it was like a seductress trying to suck me into its energy field, and I had to fight it off. And that was again what Lilith does. Seduces you, sucks you in,
Mhm.
and takes you over.
I don't know where it came from, but
Yeah.
a couple of weeks beforehand, I'd been at an exhibition, a W.B. Yeats exhibition in the National Museum, and all these cloaks were there, and the daggers from the Golden Dawn, and all, like, a lot of the books, and
Where was the exhibition?
it was in the National Museum, or the National Library in Dublin.
Right.
And yeah, and it was a W.B. Yeats, and I went to it, and he had all the cloaks that he used to wear, the masks that they used to wear in the meetings in the Golden Dawn, I think he was in.
Yeah.
But it was around after that time that it happened, and I'm not joking you. Like, I know what a bad dream is, and I know what a nightmare is, but what happened to me in that room, I have no explanation for it, and I know
What
what
actually
happened.
happened, Michael?
Excuse me.
What actually happened?
Well, as I said, I fell asleep, and it was like 5 or 6 o'clock
Oh,
in
that
the
was
evening.
after. That was after. I thought you meant in the actual room, the exhibition.
No, no, not in there.
Okay.
That's
Right.
yeah. After 2 weeks, about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks after I went to that exhibition. So as I said, I have no explanation for it. Is that the way they typically interact with humans, succubi?
Well, it sounds like it. It
Mm,
sounds like you got rid of it as well.
hmm
It didn't attach itself to you.
Yeah, I most certainly didn't want it hanging around me. And so, well, what would be the most common misconceptions about succubi, I guess? What would you say are the most do you think a lot of people experience it and they don't say anything, or is it something that is very rare?
I don't know that it's that rare. I think psychic intrusion can be quite common, but a lot of people don't remember it or choose not to remember it and think, "Oh, what was that?" I
Hmm.
think when you attune yourself and become more aware, when you hone down your awareness, then you can have much more lucidity within these experiences. That's my actual experience of it.
Very good. Like,
Uh,
when you say psychic intrusion, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like a negative thought, or what do you mean by that?
well, I'm talking about attacks now, direct
Hmm.
attacks on the psyche, on your psyche by another entity.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's mainly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
How do you protect yourself? Just you don't you just do not give your will to it. You just reject it by your own free will, I guess.
Yeah, I think the main thing is awareness. So this is where the brain waves come in, because there's different frequencies of brain waves. And when we talk about these experiences, we're talking about when the brain is very, very slow and very relaxed, 0 to 4 hertz, maybe 0 to 16 at the most, at the very most. And that's when these things can kind of become more apparent, you know, and especially if you're trying to get to sleep, because you're in that state between you're half awake, half asleep. That's the netherworld where this stuff happens. There is a gap there between conscious waking and sleep. And that gap is often where they get in, but it's also the place where everything starts, because it's where the real state of consciousness is, where the unified field actually is. So once you get, this is my view of it, and my experience is, once you get more attuned with that level and that unified field, then you become more aware of when these things are trying to get in. And a lot of people have not attuned themselves to that. So unless something is going to jump in through their being drunk or on drugs or through the abuse, then they may not be aware of things around them.
So what you're saying is, if you learn to attune your own self to what's coming in, like, what would be a sign? What would be a typical sign for you?
Right. Yeah. Interestingly, I did a course with people who were experimenting with the power of energy fields, and they did some training on psychic attack. So most people have walked into a room and got, I'm sure that person's looking at me, before they've really observed the other person, or you feel as though they've been stared at. It's quite a common thing. So that is part of this attunement, you know, and or attenuation. And I found that the more I got into that meditative state of low frequencies, half awake, half asleep, the more aware of it I became in my normal waking life. And it really helps you, because I notice people react to things around them a lot, and it stops you doing that. It doesn't mean you don't react. It means that you have an awareness, a heightened sense of awareness of what's going on around you. And I think it's really helpful. So I think it's something to actually strive for also.
Yeah.
Because it really, it seems to make a big difference. And it certainly helped me. Yeah.
Seems very positive.
Mm.
So it sounds almost as well about, you know, the UFOs and, you know, encounters with aliens, the succubi. It almost is the same kind of scenario, is it not?
I believe it to be. I know people who look into what they call abduction and contact. They call them contactees. I'm very dubious about the whole thing. I've met several who I really do believe that they are telling their truth about something. But often what happens with these experiences that people have is it destabilizes them. So their recollection of what happened is probably nothing like what actually did happen. So I think that a lot of these people who think that they've been contacted by aliens and all the rest of it are actually under some kind of attack.